Greetings. Greetings M squared here, and today we're going to talk about quadratic functions, but I wanted to remind you of what quadratic polynomials are. So they always have a degree of 2, which means a squared. So when you look over here, you remember what a quadratic monomial is. It's one term. It can have a coefficient, that's the 6, but it always has to have an x squared. Quadratic always has to have an x squared. I know it's a little confusing because you think of the word quad and you think 4, but quadratic is squared. Quartic is to the 4th power, which we aren't going to do in this lesson. Okay, then you have a quadratic binomial, and a quadratic binomial has 2 terms. That's the binomial. So we have a 3x squared as our leading term, and then a negative 5x, which is our linear term. So a quadratic binomial has 2 terms. You could also exchange that 5x for just a constant, like a 3 or a 7 or something. It would still be a quadratic binomial if you have the x squared. And then we have a quadratic trinomial. And that has 3 terms, but again, you'll see that there's an x squared in all of them. So when you look at quadratic polynomials, they always are going to have an x squared. Now today I want to talk about quadratic functions. And so I have a few kids here today that are going to help me, but we're going to get into what do you notice about all of these? What is the same? So can anyone out there help me by noticing what's the same in all these functions? Anybody? Bethany, are you paying attention?
Pick me, I see something.
Okay, Bethany, thank you for paying attention now. You may speak.
Thanks. They all have y's, just one in every single equation.
Thank you, Bethany, for that answer. That is true. Every single one of these functions have y's. Remember that y is also f of x, so you might see it that way too. It could have an f of x. Does anyone else notice anything? Yes, Frederick, go ahead. Yeah, they all have equal signs. Thank you, Frederick. Yes, each of these equations or functions does have an equal sign. Very good. Okay, does anyone notice anything else? Anyone?
Hi, M squared. I do notice something else. Oh, you look good today. What'd you do with your hair? Looks really great. Okay, anyway, what I noticed was that there's these adorable baby 2's right next to the x's. Aren't they so cute?
Thank you, Gina, for noticing what you called baby 2's. Does anyone remember what we call a baby 2?
I do remember. In mathematics, we do not call them baby 2's. When a 2 is tinier than a regular 2 and kind of to the right and above the variable, we call that number an exponent. In this case, when we have an x with an exponent of 2, we would say x squared. So it is reasonably safe to assume that in all quadratic equations, the x squared is present.
To end this video, we are going to play a game called Name That Function. Now, these are the functions we've learned about, and then quadratic is the new one. So we've learned about linear functions. Remember, linear functions have an x, but they don't have anything weird going on with x. It's not in the denominator, it's not squared, it's not absolute valued, nothing, just a plain old x. Absolute value, it's obvious if it's absolute value because it has absolute value signs. Piecewise always has 2 parts, at least 2 parts, 2 different parts of a function. An exponential is when you have an x as the exponent, and quadratic is when you have the power of 2 as the highest power. So, does anyone want to check and see if they could name all these functions? So you can pause your video right now and see if you can name them all. I am going to get some people to help me. So, Frederick, can you name any of these functions? Yeah, I know about absolute value functions because I always look for those lines. So they have these 2 little lines and then they have x in the middle of the 2 little lines. So yeah, it's pretty easy to spot those. So I know that number 4 and number 8 are absolute value functions. Nice job, Frederick. Yes, absolute value functions are a little bit easy to spot because of those lines, and you are correct. Number 4 and number 8 are indeed absolute value functions. Okay, Bethany, how about you? Would you like to pick one of those functions and figure out what you see? Why don't you take piecewise?
I think the easiest functions to spot are piecewise functions because they always have that f of x and then they have that little squiggly, bracey thing. And then they have at least two like other expressions like on top of each other. So they can have more than two, but I definitely know that number 1 is a piecewise function because it has the f of x, the squiggly guy, and then two little things.
Well done, Bethany. I think piecewise functions are also kind of easy to spot. We can see that they have an f of x, an equal sign, and then a brace. Yes, indeed. And then in this one, there are two functions. So good job, Bethany. Someone else. Thank you. Okay, let's give Linda a try. Linda, why don't you take linear functions? Which one of these functions are linear?
Linear functions are my fave. I love to watch them just go on forever and ever when I graph them. It's so much fun. So I can recognize linear functions because they only have an x. They don't have like an x squared or anything weird going on with x. Just x, like 5x or 1/2 x minus 2, stuff like that. So I know that there are two linear functions, number 2 and number 6.
Thanks. All right, let's hear from Juliet. Juliet, take exponential. Which functions do you see here that are exponential? I know what exponential functions are. Exponential functions always have an x as an exponent. And when you graph them, they kind of look like my smile when I turn my face sideways. Yeah, that's what an exponential function looks like. Thank you, Juliet. That is so true. Exponential functions are the only ones that have a little x as an exponent. And yes, number 5 is exponential, even though you forgot to mention that number. I also thought it was pretty cool how your smile does look like an exponential function when you turn your head a little sideways. Very nice, very nice. Okay, on to Agnes. Agnes, I'm wondering if you can help us out with quadratic.
The newest function we just learned about are quadratic functions. We can determine if a function is quadratic by looking at the highest degree. The highest degree in a quadratic function is a 2. That means each function needs to contain an x squared. And as you'll see, there are 3 quadratic functions. Number 3 is a quadratic function. Number 7 is a quadratic function. And number 9 is a quadratic function. So it's really easy to spot quadratic functions will always, always, always have an x squared.
Thank you, Agnes. You are always so thorough in your explanations. And yes, 3, 7, and 9 are definitely quadratic. You can tell they're quadratic because the exponent is a 2. So nice job, everyone. Thank you so much for everyone that had just a part in this. And I really appreciate your help. M squared, signing out.